Sarah Jenkins stood in the middle of a small park on the edge of Atlanta, her hands trembling as she adjusted a string of cheap fairy lights. The sun was setting, casting a soft golden glow over the patchy grass and the picnic table she had decorated with wildflowers she picked herself. She wore her best dress, a faded blue sundress she had sewn patches onto, and her dark hair was pulled back with a ribbon. Tonight was supposed to be perfect. After years of saving every penny from her waitressing job at Millie's Diner, she was finally going to be engaged to Kyle Parker. He worked at a bank downtown, always dressed in crisp shirts and polished shoes, promising her a life beyond the crumbling apartment she shared with her sick mother. Sarah smiled as she lit the last candle, imagining the future. A little house with a porch, a garden where she could grow vegetables, maybe even a dog. Kyle had been her hope, her escape from the endless shifts and the hospital bills piling up on the kitchen counter. She wasn't rich or fancy, but she believed he loved her for her heart, her quiet strength. Her few friends gathered around, chatting and sipping soda from plastic cups, waiting for Kyle to arrive. Then she saw him. Kyle stepped out of his shiny black car, his face hard and unreadable. Sarah's stomach fluttered with excitement until she noticed he wasn't smiling. He walked toward her, hands in his pockets, and stopped a few feet away. "Sarah," he said, his voice flat, "this isn't going to work." Her heart stopped. The park went silent, the hum of crickets louder than ever. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Kyle sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I met someone else. Someone who fits my life better. She's got money, connections. You're just..." He paused, looking at her patched dress and the handmade decorations. "You're just a waitress. I can't build a future with someone who smells like grease and has rough hands." Sarah felt the ground tilt beneath her. Her friends gasped, one dropping a cup that rolled across the grass. She wanted to scream, to beg him to take it back, but her throat closed up. Kyle turned to leave, then stopped. "I'm sorry, Sarah. You deserve better than pretending this could work." He walked away, back to his car, leaving her standing there with tears streaming down her face. She sank to her knees, clutching the wildflowers she had picked that morning, their petals falling apart in her hands. Her best friend Clara rushed over, kneeling beside her. "He's a jerk, Sarah. You're too good for him." But the words didn't reach her. All she could hear was Kyle's voice, sharp and cold, slicing through every dream she had built. She thought of her mother, lying in bed at home, waiting to hear good news. How could she face her now? The fairy lights flickered as the wind picked up, and Sarah felt smaller than ever, poor, unwanted, broken. She stood up slowly, brushing dirt off her dress. "I need to be alone," she mumbled, ignoring Clara's protests. She grabbed her worn jacket and started walking, not caring where she was going. The park faded behind her as the sky darkened, clouds rolling in. She had given Kyle everything, her trust, her hope, her love, and he had thrown it away like it was nothing. Rain began to fall, light at first, then harder, soaking her dress and plastering her hair to her face. She didn't stop. She couldn't. Every step felt like a fight against the weight pressing down on her chest. She was a fool to think love could lift her out of this life. By the time she reached the edge of town, the rain was a downpour. Her shoes squished with every step, and her tears mixed with the water running down her cheeks. She spotted an old bus stop shelter ahead, its roof sagging and its glass cracked. It wasn't much, but it was something. She stumbled inside, shivering, and collapsed onto the bench. Alone, drenched and lost, Sarah buried her face in her hands, wondering if this was all her life would ever be. Sarah sat shivering on the cold metal bench inside the bus stop shelter, the rain pounding against the cracked roof. Water dripped through a hole above, splashing onto her lap, but she didn't care. Her mind replayed Kyle's words over and over. "You're just a waitress. Rough hands, no future." She hugged her soaked jacket tighter, trying to hold herself together, but the ache in her chest wouldn't fade. The shelter smelled of rust and wet wood, and the dim streetlight outside flickered, casting shadows that danced across her tear-streaked face. She felt invisible, like the world had forgotten her. Then she heard footsteps, soft, steady, cutting through the roar of the rain. She looked up, wiping her eyes, and saw a man step into the shelter. He wore a faded black jacket, the hood pulled low, and a baseball cap that hid most of his face. His jeans were worn at the knees, and he carried a small backpack slung over one shoulder. In his hands was a broken umbrella, its ribs bent and fabric torn. He shook the water off himself like a dog, then glanced at her. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice low and warm, almost lost in the storm. Sarah nodded, too tired to speak. The man sat on the other end of the bench, leaving a careful distance between them. He set his backpack down and started fiddling with the umbrella, pulling a small tool from his pocket to bend the metal back into place. She watched him silently, her breath fogging in the chilly air. There was something calming about his presence, the way he focused on his task as if the world outside didn't matter. "I'm Matt," he said after a minute, not looking up. "Matt Dawson." "Sarah," she managed, her voice hoarse. She didn't know why she answered, maybe because he didn't push, didn't stare at her like she was a mess. He nodded, still working on the umbrella. "Looks like we're both stuck here," he said. "Might as well make the best of it." He finished fixing the umbrella and held it out to her. "Here. It's not much, but it'll keep the rain off your head." She stared at the umbrella, then at him. Up close she could see his face under the cap, sharp jawline, dark eyes that held a quiet kindness. "Thanks," she said, taking it. Her fingers brushed his, and for a moment she forgot the cold. "You didn't have to do that." Matt shrugged. "Didn't have anything better to do." His lips curved into a small smile, and she felt a tiny spark in her chest, something she hadn't felt all night. They sat in silence for a while, the rain a steady drumbeat around them. Then Sarah surprised herself by speaking. "My fiancé dumped me tonight," she said, staring at the puddle forming at her feet. "Right in front of everyone. Said I was good enough." Her voice cracked and she bit her lip, ashamed of how small she sounded. Matt stopped moving, his hands resting on his knees. He turned to her, his eyes steady. "Sounds like he's the one who's not good enough," he said simply. Sarah blinked, caught off guard. "You don't even know me." He leaned back against the bench, looking out at the rain. "Don't need to. Anyone who'd throw away someone like you doesn't deserve a second thought." His words were plain, but they hit her hard. She felt tears well up again, but this time they weren't from pain. "I thought he loved me," she whispered. "I gave him everything I had." Matt nodded, like he understood more than he let on. "Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who hurt us deepest." She looked at him, wondering how he could sound so sure. "You've been through it too?" she asked. He hesitated, then smiled faintly, something like that. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't push. Instead, she found herself talking more, spilling out the story of Kyle, the park, the fairy lights. Matt listened, never interrupting, just watching her with those dark, thoughtful eyes. When she finished, she laughed bitterly. "Maybe I should just marry the next guy I meet and forget all this." Matt tilted his head, a playful glint in his gaze. "Well, I'm right here. I'm not much, but I've got a decent umbrella now." Sarah laughed, a real laugh, the sound surprising her. "You're crazy," she said, shaking her head. "Maybe," he replied, grinning. "But I mean it. If you're up for it, there's a little chapel down the road. $5 and a guy who doesn't ask questions." She stared at him, her heart pounding. It was insane, ridiculous, but something about the way he looked at her, like she was worth more than Kyle ever saw, made her want to say yes. The rain slowed to a drizzle, and she stood up, clutching the umbrella. "You're serious?" she asked. He stood too, picking up his backpack. "Only if you are." She took a deep breath, the weight of the night lifting just a little. "Okay, Matt Dawson, let's do it." They ran through the damp streets, laughing like kids, the chapel's neon sign glowing ahead. Inside, a sleepy old man in a wrinkled suit agreed to marry them for $10, the last of Sarah's cash. They made rings from bits of grass Matt twisted together, and when the man said, "You may kiss the bride," Matt hesitated, then leaned in and kissed her cheek softly. Her face burned and she smiled, feeling alive for the first time in hours. As they stepped back into the night, hand in hand, Sarah didn't know what she'd just done, but for once, she didn't care. Sarah woke up to the sound of a dripping faucet and the faint smell of burnt toast. Her head throbbed from the whiskey she'd shared with Matt at the chapel, and for a moment, she didn't know where she was. The bed beneath her creaked, its thin mattress sagging under her weight. She blinked, taking in the room. Peeling wallpaper, a single bulb hanging from the ceiling, a cracked window letting in a draft. Then she saw it. A cheap grass ring on her finger, and her stomach flipped. She turned her head slowly, and there he was, Matt Dawson, her accidental husband, standing in a tiny kitchenette across the room. He wore a faded gray t-shirt and sweatpants, flipping something in a dented pan. "Morning, wife," he said, glancing over his shoulder with a grin that made her heart skip. Sarah sat up, pulling the scratchy blanket around her. "This isn't a dream, is it?" she mumbled, rubbing her eyes. Matt laughed, a deep, easy sound that filled the small space. "No, you're stuck with me now. Hope you like burnt eggs." She stared at it, then at him, and despite everything, she smiled. The apartment was worse than hers. The sink was full of mismatched dishes, the couch had a spring poking through, and the floor creaked with every step. But as she sat across from Matt, eating breakfast with a bent fork, Sarah felt something shift. Kyle had never cooked for her, never even tried. He'd taken her to fancy restaurants, sure, but it was always about showing off. Matt's eggs were terrible, but the way he watched her eat, like her opinion mattered, made them taste better than anything she'd had in months. Over the next few days, Sarah settled into this strange new life. She didn't have much to bring, just a duffel bag with her clothes and a photo of her mom. Matt gave her the bed, sleeping on the lumpy couch without complaint. He worked odd jobs around town, fixing fences or hauling firewood, coming home with dirt on his hands and a tired smile. Sarah kept her waitressing shifts at the diner, but now she walked home to Matt instead of an empty apartment. They fell into a rhythm, quiet and simple. He'd make coffee in the morning, she'd wash the cups at night. They didn't talk much about the wedding, treating it like a shared secret, a joke that wasn't really a joke. One evening, Matt suggested a walk. The sun was dipping low, painting the sky orange over the scruffy fields outside town. They wandered along the riverbank, the air cool and crisp. Matt picked up a flat stone and skipped it across the water, 4 perfect bounces. "My dad taught me that," he said, his voice soft. Sarah watched him, her hands in her pockets. "Where's he now?" she asked. Matt's smile faded. "Gone. Long time ago." He didn't say more, and she didn't push. Instead, she found a stone and tried skipping it herself. It sank with a plop. Matt laughed, stepping behind her to guide her wrist. "Like this," he said, his breath warm against her ear. Her pulse raced, and when their eyes met, she looked away, flustered. Little moments like that started piling up. He'd fix her sneakers when the sole came loose, using duct tape and a grin. She'd catch him humming old songs while he scrubbed pots, his voice low and smooth. One night they sat on the couch, sharing a bag of stale chips from the corner store. The TV was broken, so they made up stories about the people passing by outside. "That guy's a spy," Matt said, nodding at a man in a hoodie. "And she's his secret contact," Sarah added, pointing to a woman with a dog. They laughed until their sides hurt, and when their hands brushed reaching for the last chip, neither pulled away. Sarah felt herself softening. With Kyle, she'd always been on edge, trying to be pretty enough, smart enough. Matt didn't care about any of that. He liked her messy hair, her chipped nails, the way she snorted when she laughed too hard. She started to wonder if this was what love was supposed to feel like. Not grand promises, but quiet nights and someone who stayed. But then there were the odd things. One morning she saw Matt grind coffee beans by hand, pouring them into a chipped mug with a precision she'd only seen at fancy cafes. "Where'd you learn that?" she asked, curious. He shrugged. "Picked it up somewhere." Another time she noticed his boots, scuffed and worn, but the leather looked expensive, the stitching too fine for a handyman's paycheck. And once, when he thought she was asleep, she heard him on the phone in the hall, his voice low. "No, the offshore accounts are fine. Just keep the fund quiet." She opened her eyes, heart pounding, but he hung up before she could ask. The next day they went to the market. Sarah reached for a loaf of bread, but Matt swapped it for a cheaper one. "Gotta save where we can," he said, winking. She nodded, but her mind churned. He acted poor, lived poor, but something didn't add up. The way he carried himself, the casual grace in his movements, the flicker of something deeper in his eyes. She pushed it down, telling herself she was imagining things. He was Matt, her Matt, the guy who'd married her under a neon sign with a grass ring. That night, she lay awake, listening to his steady breathing from the couch. She wanted to trust him, to believe in this fragile happiness they were building, but a small voice whispered in her head, "What if he's not who he says he is?" She rolled over, staring at the grass ring still on her finger. Whatever he was hiding, she'd find out eventually. For now, she closed her eyes, letting the sound of his snores lull her to sleep, a strange comfort in the unknown. Sarah's days with Matt began to feel like a quiet melody, simple and steady, weaving through the cracks of her broken heart. She'd come home from the diner, feet aching, and find him waiting with a mug of coffee or a plate of whatever he'd scraped together, usually something half-burnt but offered with that crooked smile she'd grown to love. They didn't have much: a leaky roof, a couch with springs that poked, a life patched together like her old sundress. But it was theirs, and for the first time in years Sarah felt like she belonged somewhere. One rainy afternoon she decided to surprise Matt. He'd gone out to fix a neighbor's fence, leaving her alone in the apartment. She wanted to clean up, maybe make him dinner for once. She started with the kitchen, wiping down the counter, stacking the mismatched plates. Then she noticed a drawer in the corner, one she'd never opened. It stuck when she tugged, but with a hard pull, it gave way. Inside was a mess of junk, nails, a rusty screwdriver, and something else. A worn leather wallet tucked under a rag. Curiosity tugged at her. She hesitated, then picked it up. Her breath caught as she flipped it open. There was a driver's license, the photo unmistakably Matt, but the name wasn't Matt Dawson. It read Matthew Grayson, born in a year that matched his age, address listed as a penthouse in downtown Atlanta. Next to it was a black credit card, the kind she'd seen rich customers flash at the diner, and a folded paper that looked like a bank statement. Her hands shook as she unfolded it, the numbers blurred before her eyes, millions in an account, tied to a name she recognized from old news stories. Matthew Grayson, hotel tycoon, vanished after a financial scandal 3 years ago. Sarah dropped the wallet, her mind racing. Matt, her Matt, the man who slept on a lumpy couch and fixed fences for pocket change, was a millionaire? A billionaire? She stumbled back, hitting the counter. The room spun. Everything she'd thought about him, their life, felt like a lie. Was he laughing at her behind that easy grin? Playing some game with a poor girl who didn't know better? She heard the front door creak open and Matt stepped in, shaking rain off his jacket. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, seeing her face. She held up the wallet, her voice trembling. "Who are you, Matt? Or should I say, Matthew Grayson?" His eyes widened, then softened, a flicker of something like guilt crossing his face. He set his bag down slowly, running a hand through his wet hair. "Sarah," he started, but she cut him off. "Don't. Just tell me the truth. Are you a billionaire? Is this all a joke to you?" Her tears spilled over, hot and angry. "I trusted you. I thought you were real." Matt took a step closer, hands raised like he was calming a scared animal. "It's not a joke, I swear. Yes, I'm Matthew Grayson. I was that guy, the suits, the hotels, the money, but I walked away." She stared at him, waiting. He sighed, leaning against the wall. 3 years ago, my company got caught in a mess. Fraud, shady deals, stuff I didn't even know about until it was too late. The press tore me apart, my family turned on me, and my fiancée, she left me for someone richer when the dust settled. I had everything, Sarah, and it meant nothing. So I left, took what I could hide and started over. I didn't want anyone to know. Sarah's chest tightened. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered. Matt met her gaze, his voice steady but raw. Because I've been burned before. People see the money, not me. With you it was different. You looked at me like I was enough, just some guy with a broken umbrella. I didn't want to lose that. He stepped closer, his eyes searching hers. I didn't lie about how I feel. That night in the rain marrying you, it was the most honest thing I've done in years. She wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at her. You let me think we were the same, she said, her voice breaking. Struggling, scraping by. I poured my heart out to you, and you were sitting on millions? Matt winced. I didn't want you to love me for that. I've seen what money does, how it twists people. I wanted you to see me, the real me, not the bank account. Sarah sank onto the couch, clutching the wallet. She'd thought of their nights together, the way he'd held her hand by the river, the grass ring still on her finger. It wasn't fake, was it? The warmth in his voice, the way he'd stayed up with her when she cried about her mom's bills. But this secret, it changed everything. I don't know what to think, she said, looking up at him. I fell for the guy who fixes things with duct tape, not some tycoon hiding out. Matt knelt in front of her, his hands resting on his knees. That's still me, he said softly. The money's there, yeah, but I don't live for it. I live for this, for us. The coffee in the morning, the walks by the river, you laughing at my terrible cooking. That's what I want, Sarah. If you can't handle who I was, I'll walk away. But I'm asking you to stay. She stared into his eyes, seeing the man she'd married in that dingy chapel, the one who'd given her his umbrella and his heart. Her mind screamed at her to run, to protect herself from more hurt, but her heart, battered as it was, whispered something else. She'd loved him as a poor man, hadn't she? Could she love him knowing the truth? I need time, she said finally, her voice barely audible. Matt nodded, standing up. Take all the time you need. I'm not going anywhere. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside, leaving her alone with the wallet and a storm of feelings she couldn't untangle. She traced the grass ring with her finger, remembering the rain, the laughter, the kiss on her cheek. Matt wasn't Kyle, she knew that, but trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild. She curled up on the couch, the rain tapping against the window, and wondered if love could survive a secret this big. Sarah spent the next few days in a fog, her mind wrestling with Matt's revelation. She kept working her shifts at the diner, pouring coffee and forcing smiles, but every quiet moment brought her back to that wallet, those millions, and the man she thought she knew. Matt gave her space, sleeping on the couch, making breakfast without a word. His silence was gentle, not cold, and it made her ache even more. She wanted to trust him, to believe the Matt she'd fallen for was real, but the shadow of his secret loomed over every glance, every touch. One afternoon she decided to clear her head. She borrowed Matt's old camera, a beat-up thing he'd left on the table, and walked to the riverbank where they'd skipped stones. The water sparkled under the sun, and she snapped a photo, the click of the shutter grounding her. She'd started taking pictures lately, little moments of their life, the chipped mugs, the wildflowers by the road. It was something she hadn't done since Kyle, who'd mocked her hobby as childish. With Matt, it felt different, like he saw beauty in the things she loved. She posted the photo online, a rare impulse, captioning it, "Finding Peace." That night she came home to find Matt in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup. He looked up, his eyes soft. "Thought you might be hungry," he said. She nodded, sitting at the table. They ate in quiet, the clink of spoons the only sound. "I'm trying," she said finally, her voice small. "To understand. It's just a lot." Matt set his spoon down. "I know. And I'm sorry I didn't tell you sooner. Whatever you decide, I meant what I said. This, us, it's real to me." She looked at him, his face honest and open, and felt her walls crack a little more. The next morning, everything changed. Sarah was wiping tables at the diner when the door chimed. She turned and her heart sank. Kyle stood there, his hair slicked back, his shirt wrinkled but still expensive. He looked different, thinner, his eyes shadowed. "Sarah," he said, stepping closer, "I've been looking for you." She froze, gripping the rag. "What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice tight. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I saw your photo online. Figured I'd find you in this dump of a town." She stepped back, her pulse racing. "Get out, Kyle. We're done." He shook his head, moving closer. "I messed up, okay? That girl, she left me when my deal fell through. I lost everything. The car, the apartment. I need you, Sarah. We can start over." His voice dripped with desperation, but it was the same charm he'd used before, hollow and rehearsed. She laughed bitterly. "You think I'd take you back after what you did? You humiliated me." He grabbed her arm, his grip tight. "Come on. Don't be stupid. You're better off with me than this hole." Before she could pull away, the kitchen door swung open. Matt stepped out, his apron dusted with flour from helping the cook. "Let her go," he said, his voice low and firm. Kyle smirked, sizing him up. "Who's this? Your rebound? Some broke loser in a dirty shirt?" Matt didn't flinch. "I'm her husband. And you're leaving." Kyle laughed, loud and sharp. "Husband? You married this guy? Oh, Sarah, you really hit rock bottom." Sarah yanked her arm free, glaring at him. "He's worth 100 of you, Kyle." Kyle's smirk faded, but he didn't leave. He leaned in, whispering, "You'll regret this." He stormed out, slamming the door. Sarah exhaled, her hands shaking. Matt touched her shoulder, gentle but steady. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, leaning into him for a moment, his warmth chasing away Kyle's shadow. "Thanks," she said. He smiled faintly. "Anytime." But trouble wasn't done with them. 2 days later, Sarah was walking home when a man in a dark coat stopped her. He held a recorder, his eyes sharp. "Sarah Jenkins? I'm Tom Reese, freelance reporter. I've got a tip you're living with Matthew Grayson, the missing tycoon. Care to comment?" Her stomach dropped. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, stepping back. He grinned. "Come on, I've got photos. You two at the river, cozy as can be. This is big news. How's it feel, shacking up with a billionaire?" She ran, her heart pounding, bursting into the apartment. Matt was there fixing a chair, and he stood when he saw her face. "What's wrong?" he asked. "A reporter," she gasped. "He knows who you are. He's got pictures. He said it's going to be a story." Matt's jaw tightened, his calm cracking. "Damn it," he muttered, pacing. "I thought I'd covered my tracks." Sarah grabbed his arm. "How did he find you?" Matt shook his head. "Could be anyone. Old contacts, bank records. I've been careful, but not perfect." She stared at him, fear mixing with anger. "What happens now? Everyone will know. They'll think I'm with you for the money." Matt stopped, turning to her. "Is that what you think matters to me? What they say?" She swallowed, tears welling up. "No, but it's not just that. Kyle was here and now this. It's too much." He took her hands, his voice urgent. "Sarah, listen, I can fix this. I'll talk to him, pay him off if I have to, but I need you to tell me what you want. If this life, us, is too hard, I'll walk away, no strings. But if you stay, I'll fight for you, for real." Her mind spun. Kyle's return had shaken her, and now this reporter threatened to drag them into a spotlight she'd never wanted. She thought of her mom, still sick, the bills unpaid. Matt could solve that with a snap of his fingers, but that wasn't why she'd married him. She remembered the rain, the chapel, the way he'd looked at her like she was enough. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice steady. "I want you. But I can't do this if you're not honest with me." Matt nodded, his grip tightening on her hands. "No more secrets, I promise." Before they could say more, the door banged open. Kyle stood there, smirking, the reporter behind him. "Found your little hideout, Grayson," Kyle said. "Told this guy everything I know. You're finished." Sarah's heart sank as Matt stepped forward, his eyes blazing. The past wasn't just back, it was here to break them apart. Sarah's breath caught as Kyle stormed into the apartment, the reporter Tom Reese trailing behind with a smug grin. Matt's face hardened, his hands curling into fists at his sides. The air crackled with tension, the small room suddenly too tight for the weight of their pasts colliding. "You think you can hide forever, Grayson," Kyle sneered, crossing his arms. I dug around after I saw you at the diner. Found some old buddies who remembered you, told this guy everything. You're a fraud, and she's just your latest pity project. He jerked his head towards Sarah, his eyes cold. Sarah stepped forward, fury burning through her fear. Get out, Kyle. You don't know anything about us. Tom raised his recorder, unfazed. Oh, I think the world will want to know. Billionaire fakes a poor life, marries a waitress. It's gold. So, Sarah, what's it like playing house with a liar? Matt moved between them, his voice low and dangerous. Leave her out of this. You want a story? Talk to me. Kyle laughed, sharp and bitter. Too late, pal. I gave him the dirt. Your company's collapse, the lawsuits, how you ran like a coward. You can't buy your way out of this one. Sarah's heart pounded. She looked at Matt, searching his face. He'd promised no more secrets, but now the truth was spilling out, ugly and raw. Is that true? She asked, her voice trembling. Matt met her gaze, steady despite the chaos. I didn't run because I was guilty. I ran because I couldn't fix it. I let people down. And I hated who I'd become. But I'm not that man anymore. Tom scribbled notes, grinning. Nice sob story. Doesn't change the headline. You're a has-been, Grayson, and she's your ticket to a feel-good comeback. Sarah's hands shook. She thought of the grass ring, the river walks, the quiet nights. Was that all a lie, too? But then she saw Matt's eyes, the same ones that had found her in the rain, and she knew. He wasn't playing her. He was fighting for her, even now. Enough, she said, her voice cutting through the room. She turned to Kyle. You don't get to ruin this. You threw me away because I wasn't enough for your shiny little world. Matt stayed. He saw me when you didn't. She faced Tom, chin high. Write what you want. Say I'm a fool. Say he's a fraud. I don't care. I love him, rich or poor, and that's more than either of you will ever understand. Kyle's smirk faltered. Tom lowered his recorder, caught off guard. Matt stared at her, his expression softening into something raw and unguarded. Sarah, he whispered, but she held up a hand. Not done. Kyle, you're pathetic, coming back here because you've got nothing left. And you, she pointed at Tom, you're just chasing a paycheck. Get out, both of you. Kyle hesitated, then shrugged. Your loss, he muttered, turning to leave. Tom lingered, eyeing Matt. You sure you don't want to pay me off? Could save you a lot of trouble. Matt shook his head. No deals. Write your story. I'm done hiding. Tom smirked and followed Kyle out, the door slamming behind them. Silence settled, heavy and thick. Sarah sank onto the couch, her strength draining away. Matt knelt in front of her, taking her hands. You didn't have to do that, he said softly. Stand up for me like that. She looked at him, tears brimming. Yes, I did. Because it's true. I love you, Matt. Not the money, not the name, you. He brushed a tear from her cheek, his touch gentle. I don't deserve you, he said. But I love you, too. More than anything. He stood, pulling her into his arms. She buried her face in his chest, breathing in the familiar scent of him, coffee and wood and home. What happens now? She asked, muffled against his shirt. Matt rested his chin on her head. The story'll run, people will talk, but we'll be okay. I've got enough stashed away to take care of your mom's bills if you'll let me. After that, we figure it out together. She pulled back, meeting his eyes. No more secrets? He nodded. None. Just us. A week later, Tom's article hit the papers. Fallen tycoon weds waitress in small-town scandal, it blared. The town buzzed, neighbors whispering. But Sarah and Matt didn't hide. They faced it hand in hand, her at the diner, him fixing fences. The story faded fast, overshadowed by bigger news, and life settled again. Matt sold some old investments, quietly paying off her mother's medical debt. When Sarah's mom hugged him, tears in her eyes, he just smiled and said, Family takes care of family. One evening, they sat by the river, the same spot where they'd skipped stones. The sun dipped low, painting the water gold. Matt pulled something from his pocket, a small box. Sarah's breath hitched as he opened it, revealing a simple silver ring, no diamonds, just a band etched with tiny stars. "I know the grass ring worked for a while," he said, grinning, "but I thought you might like this. For real this time." He slid it onto her finger, then looked at her, serious. "Sarah Jenkins, will you marry me again? Not in a storm, not on a whim, but because I want you forever." She laughed, tears spilling over. "Yes," she said, throwing her arms around him. He kissed her, not on the cheek this time, but full and deep, a promise sealed under the fading light. They stayed there, wrapped in each other, the river flowing past like time washing away the pain. Months later, they opened a coffee shop in town, a little place with mismatched chairs and wildflowers on the tables. Sarah baked muffins, her hands dusted with flour, while Matt brewed coffee with that barista precision she'd once questioned. Locals came, then travelers drawn by the story of the billionaire who chose love over wealth. They didn't flaunt the money, living above the shop in a modest apartment, but they gave back, funding a clinic for the uninsured. A quiet nod to Sarah's mom. One sunny afternoon, Sarah watched Matt pour coffee for a customer, his laugh echoing through the room. She thought back to that night in the rain, the broken umbrella, the chapel. She'd been a poor girl with a shattered dream, abandoned by the man she'd trusted. Now she stood here, whole again, not because of money, but because of him. Matt caught her eye and winked, and she smiled, her heart full. Kyle faded into memory, a footnote in a life she'd outgrown. The reporter's story became just words on a page, powerless against what they'd built. Sarah had lost everything once, her hope, her pride, her love. But in losing, she'd found more, a man who saw her worth, a life that mattered. She walked over to Matt, slipping her hand into his. "Happy?" he asked, squeezing her fingers. "More than I ever thought I could be," she said. And as the sun streamed through the window, casting light on their little world, Sarah knew she'd made the best choice of her life, marrying a poor man who turned out to be so much more. Years slipped by like pages in a well-loved book, and the little coffee shop Sarah and Matt had built became more than just a place to grab a drink. It grew into a cornerstone of the town, its wooden sign reading Jenkins and Grayson in faded paint, a quiet testament to their union. The walls were lined with Sarah's photographs, black and white shots of the river, the wildflowers, and Matt's hands pouring coffee. Customers lingered over muffins and stories, drawn by the warmth that radiated from the couple behind the counter. Sarah's dark hair was streaked with gray now, and Matt's grin carried a few more lines, but their love shone as bright as ever. They'd stayed simple, even with Matt's wealth tucked away. The apartment above the shop was home, its creaky floors and patched curtains a comfort rather than a burden. Sarah's mom lived with them now, her health fragile but stable, spending her days in a rocking chair by the window, smiling at the life her daughter had found. The clinic they'd funded hummed along, helping folks who'd once been in Sarah's shoes, scraping by with no safety net. It wasn't flashy, but it mattered, and that was enough. One spring morning, Sarah stood at the counter, rolling dough for a fresh batch of muffins. The door chimed, and a young woman stepped in, her clothes worn, her eyes tired. She hesitated, clutching a few crumpled dollars. "Just a coffee, please," she said, voice barely above a whisper. Sarah recognized that look, the weight of a world too heavy to carry. She slid a muffin across the counter with the coffee, waving off the extra cash. "On the house," she said, smiling. The woman blinked, then nodded, a flicker of gratitude in her gaze. Matt emerged from the back, wiping his hands on a towel. He caught Sarah's eye and winked, knowing her soft spot for strays. "You're going to bankrupt us with those freebies," he teased, leaning against the counter. She swatted him with a rag, laughing. "Says the guy who gave away half our firewood last winter." He grinned, pulling her close for a quick kiss, heedless of the customers watching. It was a dance they'd perfected over time, playful and tender, rooted in a trust that had weathered every storm. That afternoon they closed early and drove to the riverbank, a ritual they'd kept since the early days. The grass was lush, the water glinting under a pale blue sky. They sat on a blanket, sharing a thermos of coffee, the silver rings on their fingers catching the light. Sarah rested her head on Matt's shoulder, her hand finding his. "Remember when we came here that first time?" she asked. He chuckled, squeezing her fingers. "How could I forget? You sank every stone I gave you." She smiled, the memory as vivid as yesterday. "And you still married me." He turned to her, his eyes soft. "Best decision I ever made, grass ring and all." She looked out at the river, thinking of the girl she'd been, poor and broken, abandoned by a man who didn't see her worth. Matt had changed that, not with his money, but with his heart. "I was so scared back then," she said quietly, "scared I'd never be enough." He brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You were always enough, Sarah. I just helped you see it." They sat in silence, the river's gentle rush filling the space between words. Then Matt reached into his pocket, pulling out a small envelope. "Got something for you," he said, handing it to her. She opened it, puzzled, and found a deed, a plot of land just outside town. "What's this?" she asked. He grinned, a spark of mischief in his eyes. "Thought we could build a house. Nothing big, just a porch, a garden, maybe a spot for your mom to watch the birds. A real home." Sarah's throat tightened, tears prickling her eyes. It was the dream she'd whispered to him years ago, back when they were still figuring each other out. "You remembered," she said, her voice thick. He nodded. Every word. She leaned in, kissing him softly, the taste of coffee lingering between them. "I love you," she whispered. "Always," he replied, holding her close. Months later, the house took shape. A modest cabin with a wide porch and flower boxes under the windows. They moved in on a crisp fall day, Sarah's mom beaming as she settled into a chair with a view of the trees. The coffee shop stayed open, run by a young couple they'd trained, but Sarah and Matt spent more time at home now, tending the garden, sipping coffee at sunrise. One evening they sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge. Sarah pulled out her old camera, snapping a photo of Matt, his graying hair glowing in the dusk. She thought of Kyle sometimes, a distant echo of pain that no longer stung. He'd faded into obscurity, last she heard, bouncing between dead-end jobs. The reporter's story had come and gone, a blip that couldn't touch what they'd built. Sarah had lost everything once, her dreams, her trust, her hope, but in the ashes she'd found Matt, a stranger who became her everything. Together they'd turned a whim in the rain into a legacy of love, not just for themselves, but for everyone they touched. As the night deepened, Matt took her hand, leading her inside. The cabin glowed with lamplight, photos and memories lining the walls. Sarah smiled, her heart full. She'd been a poor girl with nothing, but now she had a home, a purpose, a man who'd chosen her above all else. And as they sat by the fire, the world quiet around them, she knew this was the ending she'd always wanted. Not a fairy tale, but a real, beautiful life.